Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
My name is Brother Anselm, and I'm the coordinator of the Mount Angel Institute, and I want to welcome you all to this morning's lecture titled Applied Thomistic Psychology, Hope for Our Disordered World, sponsored by the Mount Angel Institute in collaboration with our Benedictine Oblate program. The mission of the Institute is to share rich ways of being together, of prayer, of hospitality, of deep reading, of centering on the Eucharist, and of promoting arts and culture and care for land and environment. And we do that primarily by offering lectures, offering speakers, and offering concerts to the public. Now, with this lecture in particular, with the fragmentation, division, and ideology as the unfortunate characteristics of contemporary society, and of even the understanding of personal identity, Thomas Aquinas comes back to us with a voice of sober wisdom, highlighting a true psychology, a true study of the soul. The Freudian specter is somehow upended by the dumb ox, a title that Thomas Aquinas was named, interpreted and retrieved for us by Dr. Christin McIntyre. She has been in outpatient practice as a psychiatrist in the Portland area since 2002. She continues to see patients in Oregon and Washington by telehealth since relocating to Idaho in 2021. Psychotherapy continues to be a main focus of her practice, and to better serve a growing number of Catholic patients in recent years, she has pursued training in Thomistic Psychology, as well as with the John Paul II Healing Center. She and her husband are oblates of Mount Angel Abbey, where she offers periodic retreats that draw from her experience in clinical psychiatry, spiritual healing ministry, and the Catholic faith. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Christin McIntyre.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. It is a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to be at the Abbey. And it's a pleasure to talk about what I'm here to talk to you about today, which is Thomistic Psychology. I need to make a disclaimer quickly, which is that I have no background whatsoever in philosophy. So my training was originally in basic science and laboratory science, and I went from there into medicine, and then from medicine into psychiatry and into psychotherapy, which has been part of my practice since the beginning. Catholicism came in there somewhere between medical school and residency. So all that to say, it's really only been within the last 7 or 8 years that I've even had an understanding of the significance of who St. Thomas was in general, but particularly the incredible wisdom that he has for us in the field of mental health. So I liken his work to the original owner's manual to the human person. You know, if you have a car and you want to find out how to repair it, or even just get the most out of what it can do, you do well to read the manual, although many of us don't. Because if you understand how something is designed in the first place, then you can get the best performance out of it, and you can repair it or make improvements to it in the most effective way. You certainly want to know if the vehicle you're driving takes diesel or regular gasoline, but you also might want to know what its towing capacity is, you know, so that you can pull the utility trailer you got or a boat you just bought. So an understanding of Thomistic psychology offers us the manual to the human person. But it was harder than I expected to understand exactly what it is that Thomistic psychology refers to. You know, when I first started hearing about it, it sounded great. It sounded like, okay, this is the authentically Catholic version of psychology. And I heard so many people say how wonderful it was, but it's more than just a Catholic understanding of Thomistic anthropology while you're practicing psychology. The two need to be integrated in a particular way. And to do that, there are some key concepts that you have to understand and appreciate. So that's what I'm hoping to be able to explain to you today. So just to sort of show you how difficult it is to kind of get your mind around this or get a handle on it, when you Google the term Thomistic psychology, you find things like this. This is at psychologydictionary.org. It defines Thomistic psychology as the psychological standards found within the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, brought about in the formative 20th century by, and this is an error on the website, by many of Roman Catholic thinkers. And Aquinas stressed Aristotelian logic, the compatibility of reason combined with faith, the free will of human beings, and the knowledge of God as ultimate happiness. So I don't know about you, but I don't find that enlightening. And with that typo in there, I get the distinct impression that whoever wrote it didn't really know what it was either. So as I asked more people who seemed to know, many of them Dominicans, I was told I should read books like these by Conrad Bars, including one he co-authored with his colleague, and I apologize, I do not know how to pronounce her last name, Anna Taru or something like that. Psychic Wholeness and Healing, or this other one, Feeling and Healing Your Emotions. There are others. These are excellent books, but maybe it's just me, but I had a hard time getting what I was looking for out of these. I mean, God rest his soul, Conrad Bars was an incredible human being. He was very, very intelligent, very faithful, but he was also from a previous era. And in mental health, that means he was trained, he kind of came out of a time in mental health that was really dominated by Freud, frankly. And although, I mean, I have some training in that direction too, he comes at it from a very psychodynamic background and also with more philosophy under his belt than I had. So it frankly makes it a little less accessible to those of us who trained in the 90s and forward. So the defect there was probably mine, and I can own that, but I felt the need to keep looking for other authors to explain what Thomistic psychology was, or what in any kind of psychology could be considered to be Thomistic. So there's a classic from the 1940s that I came across by Father Robert Brennan, also a Dominican, entitled Thomistic Psychology, a philosophic analysis of the nature of man. And then in 2013, Father Chad Ripperger wrote a massive book called The Introduction to the Science of Mental Health. And both of these do an excellent job of summarizing everything St. Thomas had to say about human psychology. They're both excellent references. Unfortunately, lacking any background in philosophy, I found them, at least at first, completely impenetrable. And there's other books as well, but they tend to be written by theologians, not mental health practitioners. So it's sort of like if you want to learn how to cook and someone gives you a book that covers the science of cooking, it's helpful to know the temperature at which water boils and the difference between baking powder and baking soda. But if you want to learn how to cook, you need a recipe. I was looking for recipes. I was trained in research science prior to medicine, I think in terms of protocols and goals and steps. And a lot of my patients do too. So finally, I attended some presentations by Dr. Patrick DiVietri, who used to teach this material in Rome and at Christendom College, as well as by Jean-Marie Ganichot, who's an LCSW, who trained under Dr. DiVietri before he retired. So finally, the two of them spoke my language, brought it down to a level that I could start to understand. Even with their help, it's taken me several years. Truly, this stuff is really, really complex, and it's very philosophical. But the more I understood, the more compelled I have felt to try to explain it to other people, because it's incredible. It's finally permitted the kind of integration that I've been searching for years between what I do all day as a psychiatrist and my Catholic faith. The point of this slide is this is St. Athanasius Church in Rome. And the point is integration. I mean, you'll see right next to the church someone's apartment, you know, their little balcony there with looks like a tree. So this church is in the middle of a city. People live and work right next door, and all around it. There's no physical separation. So that's the ideal, as far as I'm concerned, between our faith and how we live, how we understand our psychology. So that's what I was going for. In these presentations, I have hoped to distill out some truly practical information. I wanted to help a lay audience, not a bunch of philosophers or theologians, and not a bunch of mental health practitioners necessarily, appreciate something about how we were designed by God to thrive and be happy so that we can get back there when things go off the rails, because many people in our world today are not thriving. They're not happy. I don't have to cite a bunch of statistics to convince any one of you how much suffering is present in the world, how much mental illness and just plain despair. You know, the secular media talks incessantly about various mental health crises, especially among young people, and they're right, it's a crisis. And everyone has some kind of solution to propose. Let's fund this initiative, that initiative, let's get more counselors into schools, let's educate teens about social media, let's have conferences about suicide prevention. Clearly we need more therapists, so let's train more therapists. Let's reduce stigma, let's make mental health care more accessible, more affordable, better covered by insurance. Let's put therapists in all the schools. Surely that will help, right? Well, it's not unreasonable to think so on the surface of it. And I will absolutely agree there don't seem to be enough good therapists or mental health prescribers. At least most people struggle to find one who's accepting patients these days. But just increasing access to or utilization of mental health services doesn't seem to solve anything. Some of you might be aware of a book recently published by Abigail Schreier called Bad Therapy: Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up. I'm not going to go into it today. She makes some good points in this book, but I'm not sure I agree with all of them. But there's also other, recent articles with headlines like this one in Time magazine. Therapy isn't fixing America's mental health crisis. Or in the Atlantic, these teens got therapy, then they got worse. So what's going on? Well, this Atlantic article references a study that was done in Australia where they took like 1,000 teenagers and they gave half of them weekly therapy, specifically a very well-regarded, well-studied therapy called DBT, which stands for dialectical behavioral therapy. And this was developed for people with very unstable emotions, like teenagers, right? So how could this not help? They did this study expecting it was going to be a slam dunk, that the teens who did the therapy would benefit compared to their peers that didn't. But that isn't what happened. The treatment group actually got worse. Now, I was gratified to read, following this, in the mainstream mental health press, no less, a very insightful commentary on this study by some researchers out of UC San Diego, who called out the grandiose stance psychiatry has at times taken of late. Rising rates of mental illness in the community are not interpreted as a failing of the field of psychiatry, but as evidence we need more psychiatrists. So their point is a very good one. We can't assume that what modern mental health is doing is actually helping people. As mental health professionals, we need to acknowledge when we fail, and we need to learn from those failures so that we can do better. One very well-documented failure, which is quite easy to read about online, occurred in the 1960s when psychologist Dr. Carl Rogers and two of his associates were invited into a large religious community in the Los Angeles area called the Sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Dr. Rogers and his associates conducted encounter groups, all the rage back then, according to the principles of Humanistic Psychology, which, as the name indicates, is a very human, emotion-focused type of psychology. In other words, I determine my truth and my values. Humanistic psychology, as I said, is very emotion-driven. If it feels good, do it. And spoiler alert, this shares very little in common with St. Thomas. Anyway, long story short, at the conclusion of their intervention, there were 68 sisters left. Over 300 had left their vows in an astonishingly short period of time. Now, admittedly, this happened in the middle of the upheaval of the 1960s, so there had already been many forces at work prior to destabilizing that community, prior to Dr. Rogers and his associates showing up. Still, the effect that their interventions had was so dramatic that one of Dr. Rogers' associates, a psychologist by the name of Bill Colson, was deeply troubled by what had happened with the sisters. Not just that so many left their vows, but by the chaos that ensued and the obvious disorder and dissolution that was evident for so many of them. They did not appear to be finding the blissful liberation they had been promised by humanistic psychology. And shortly after this, Dr. Colson parted ways with Dr. Rogers, who had previously been his mentor, if not his hero. But after what he had seen, Dr. Colson had come to believe that what they had been doing and the psychological principles on which it was based was terribly wrong, and that his longtime mentor's ideas were actually destroying lives, not just in that community. He went on kind of a crusade the rest of his career to try to undo the damage he had done. So the point of this story is, here is an example of a mental health intervention based, as they all are, on a particular set of assumptions and ideas that, when applied, increased disorder and distress. So by all external appearances, it made these people's lives and their mental health worse. Does anyone recognize this building? This is part of the old Oregon State Hospital, which was used in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So, why should Thomistic psychology expect to be any better? Well, for one thing, the philosophy, the ideas on which it's based, are kind of the inverse of humanistic psychology. I'll explain this in much more detail as we go, but for now, suffice it to say that in humanistic psychology, the soul serves the flesh. If it brings pleasure and satisfaction, it must be good. And so emotions are in the driver's seat as you seek fulfillment. In Thomism, the flesh is at the service of the soul. We sublimate our passions and the desires of the flesh in order to pursue a higher good. The other reason why Thomistic psychology seems likely to be more fruitful and more efficacious than its inverse is that we have some additional evidence that the way St. Thomas understood the human person is, in fact, the authentic understanding, the way God made us, the original owner's manual. So this comes from exorcists. Father Chad Ripperger in particular will say that St. Thomas understands human psychology the way angels do, including fallen angels. He says this because he has observed directly that demons appear to know with incredible precision how to tempt us, how to distract us, and how to knock us off course in our spiritual life. And when Father Ripperger applied a fully Thomistic understanding of psychology to his exorcism work, he found that he was able to help people protect themselves far better than otherwise against all forms of spiritual attack, even just ordinary temptation. So this brings me to my hypothesis. Remember I said I'm a scientist, or I was. I propose that if a Thomistic understanding of human psychology is correct, if this is the way God designed us, then everything in modern psychology that works, everything we do that's actually helping people can be explained by Thomistic principles. In other words, everything that works insofar as it respects Thomistic anthropology. And anything that departs from those principles is not likely to be helpful and may do harm. So any type of therapy will be effective only to the degree to which it respects and restores the way that we were designed by God. So let's finally get into what I mean by Thomistic psychology. If this is the original owner's manual, it's a huge one. It's got a lot of detail. As I mentioned before, Father Ripperger wrote a very, very large book that he calls the Introduction to the Science of Mental Health, which is, of course, sort of funny that it's just an introduction. He distilled out of the Summa Theologica basically everything that pertains to human psychology, very methodically lays it out. From this, he constructed a diagram, which I will show you now. So this is like that schematic in the back of an appliance manual, you know, the one that's completely not helpful to the average homeowner. But let me see if I can point out some of the basics, and then we're going to switch to something much simpler. So according to St. Thomas, we are a body and soul composite. So everything on this diagram can be classified as either material, meaning part of the physical body, or immaterial, meaning there's an immaterial component. It's part of our immaterial soul, not dependent on the body. Many parts of us, many of our faculties, meaning our operative parts, are both. They have both a material and an immaterial element, but some are primarily or exclusively one or the other. We are one, a body-soul composite, but these operations might exist, might be accidents of one or the other. So an example of a just physical body part of us, material faculty, would be our muscles and our bones, the structures within us that we use to walk around. This would be our locomotive faculty. So that's hopefully you can see it there. Another body-only function is respiration or breathing. And that falls under vegetative faculties, as does digestion. So these are body-only, material-only. There's no immaterial component. Everybody with me so far? Okay, so above that, at the top right-hand corner of the slide, are the immaterial faculties. And the topmost ones there are the purely immaterial ones, those that are reserved to the soul. They don't depend on a material component for their operation, namely the intellect and the will. When we die, when we are separated from our physical bodies, awaiting resurrection, those faculties are entirely preserved, just as they were in life, like the angels. Angels are pure intellect and will. Then there's all this stuff in the middle, which is both immaterial and material. There's components of both. For example, emotions, which more or less correspond to what is referred to as appetites on the bottom right corner of this slide. When we have emotions, there's a physical component to it. We feel anger or anxiety or love or grief. We feel those things in our physical bodies, as well as having an immaterial awareness of it, in other words, in our soul. So memory is another good example. There's a part of memory that's purely physical, material. So if you have a stroke that damages a certain part of your brain, you will lose the ability to store or retrieve memory in a particular way. But those memories are still there. There's an immaterial component that doesn't go away. So I want to quickly point out on this slide, just a little to the right of the middle, the common sense power. This isn't common sense like we usually use the term. This is an internal sense that makes a concept out of all the external sense data that comes in. So sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell. All those external senses, those are material. And then they connect to parts of your brain that interpret that and integrate it. That's still material. Where it crosses over into the immaterial is where we form an understanding of what it is that we've just sensed. The common sense power integrates all the external sense data into one idea. So the concept of, smooth texture, yellow color, the smell of banana peel, and the taste of a banana, each of those is one data point, and the common sense power puts it all together to make a banana. Another way to say this is the common sense power grasps as one thing what is heard, seen, tasted, touched, smelled, and then it places that into the imagination. You see the arrow going from common sense to imagination. So the idea of a banana ends up in the imagination, and then it can be linked to any similar images in the memory. So you end up with this idea of a grasped, known, familiar item, a banana, that may then stimulate an emotional response, good or bad. Do I want this or do I not? And you see the connection there between the imagination and the appetites, which again, that's more or less the same things as emotions for our purposes. So I'm sorry, I know this is really complex, and I promise we'll bring it down to a simpler schematic in just a minute. I just want to point out one more thing, which is probably the most important thing to take from this whole diagram, which is this thing off to the right called the cogitative power. In my humble opinion, that's where the money is. This is what really makes Thomistic psychology unique from everything else in modern mental health or any time. And it's extremely practically useful, and you'll see what I mean. The cogitative power functions as a kind of project manager for all the material faculties. It's going to take the data from all these other things, the common sense power, memory, imagination, appetites, emotions, all this stuff, and just like the common sense power makes a banana out of various pieces of external sense data, the cogitative power makes it into a whole concept, which is called a phantasm. And I don't love that word, but I don't know what else to call it. So it's not just a banana. It's a banana that is connected to all the bananas you have ever seen and eaten in your whole life. It's connected to how you feel about bananas, how you feel about that banana, what you want from that banana. Is it not ripe enough? Is it too ripe? Does it have a bruise? Is it gonna make your backpack smell funny if you take it to school with you, like happened last time? All of this goes into the phantasm. And that gets sent up to the intellect, where you, in your higher faculties, get to make a judgment and think about that phantasm, reason through your options, and then the will can make or carry out the decision that's made. So the point that I need to make before we move on from this, don't worry, we'll go through this again several times using other examples to make it more clear, is that the cogitative power has a lot of power. It's almost like a junior brain. A minute ago, I called it a project manager for the lower faculties. And just like a project manager in a company, it's got some limited autonomy. It's got the ability to make some decisions, some judgments relative to its area of influence. It gets to decide what information it sends upstairs about its particular project. and how to package it and how to label it. Is it urgent or not? But the project manager is not the CEO of the company. So the CEO is up top in the higher faculties. The project manager reports to the CEO, but if the CEO is telling it, I don't care how much I like bananas, I'm on a low-carb diet, then it needs to be able to override its desire for the banana. The cogitative power needs to be able to override all the fond memories and associations and even its physical hunger, so that the person's will can act to leave the banana alone as the intellect has deemed needs to be the case. If the project manager, the junior brain, the cogitative power, is not in the habit of taking orders from upstairs, if it's a little insubordinate, then the phantasm that it sends back can, in essence, flood the intellect and the will with strong emotional sentiments about how hungry you are and how it would be rude to refuse this banana that your coworker is offering you to be nice. And then there may be fear that you won't have another chance to eat anything for hours and hours because you forgot your lunch. And I think we all know how this happens when you're on a diet. So this is the importance, this is the influence of the cogitative power. It can be trained to serve us well, or it can be unleashed and drive us to drink, quite literally. So this is a greatly simplified schematic of the faculties of the human person, more or less according to St. Thomas. Now, anytime you simplify something, you're going to introduce some squishiness, some inaccuracy. That's unavoidable. For a real Thomist like Father Ripperger, bringing it down to this level can be a teeny bit painful because there's so much information that you lose or risk distorting. But the most important concepts are in here, with one exception, and they can really help people. In fact, this slide is actually, or some version of it, is something I use a fair amount clinically, because the idea of our faculties having an order and a hierarchy to them is something that just makes sense to people, even those without an explicit religious faith. So in this streamlined version, you can see the intellect and the will at the top, because these are our highest faculties. And again, these are the only two faculties that are, we can say, reserved to the soul. They are immaterial. There isn't a material component. These are where we most closely reflect the image and likeness of God and are most similar to the angels. It is here we can seek union with him by forming our intellect in the truth and conforming our will to his will. As an aside, as I understand it, this explains why all human life is sacred. Because if you have a human soul, you have these. You are created in the image and likeness of God, up here in your highest faculties, regardless of what the rest of you looks like. So then in descending order from there, there's the memory and emotion in the middle, and appetite and instinct in the bottom. And now I'm using the word appetite in more of a conventional way. So the faculties are ordered in this way, sort of according to how material versus immaterial they are. So the lowest faculties at the bottom are largely flesh-based faculties. These are focused on physical comfort and self-preservation, right? Me first. These we share with animals. These middle faculties, memory and emotion, are more of a bridge. There's a physical animal component. You know, dogs and cats have memories and emotions. And actually, they also have something akin, similar to the cogitative power, but ours have a very prominent immaterial component and connection to our higher faculties that dogs and cats don't have. The arrows on each side indicate the proper order, the hierarchy as God designed it, and then as it exists in the reverse. So as Catholics, we seek to, as I said, put our flesh to the service of our soul. And ultimately, this is what virtue looks like. Faith, hope, and charity, prudence, temperance, justice, fortitude. You see it? The inverse of this is essentially what's promoted by humanistic psychology. The soul becomes hostage to the flesh, and you act according to what's good down at the bottom, and you justify it later. There's no objective truth. Truth is whatever seems good to you, whatever works for you. This leads at minimum to an immature self-focus and hedonism, and at worst, it leads to addiction, narcissism, abuse of all kinds, and frank evil. Do you see it? Go downtown, you'll see it. But where's the cogitative power on this slide? Well, you're right, it's not here. I'm still working out the best way to explain this to people. What I've come up with for this particular image is this. What the cogitative power does can be summarized as packaging up all this middle and lower faculty data and presenting it to the higher faculties. But now I want to go into a little more depth about this process. So as we said before, the cogitative power is like a project manager for the lower faculties. It collates all this data. It makes some judgments about it. This is why I referred to it as the junior brain. It can judge, but it doesn't have the full power or wisdom of the higher intellect, and that's extremely important. So the cogitative power can do three things. Compose and divide. This is a fancy way of saying compare and contrast. The cogitative power figures out how it's going to judge something by identifying what it's similar to and what it's different from. So is this like something familiar to me? Is this somehow unlike other things I've seen? Have I ever seen anything like this before? So that's a banana, and it looks like other bananas I've seen and eaten before that I really remember liking. There's just a hint of green at the stem end and a full yellow color with no brown spots. So then it can assess the good or the harm or the usefulness of something. So that looks like a really good banana, the kind of banana that's at the exact point of ripeness I like best. Also, my coworker, who I've been wanting to get to know better, is very kindly offering this to me, and the timing could not be better because I'm starving. It's been 3 hours since breakfast, and I forgot my lunch. So now, it prepares the phantasm for abstraction to the possible intellect. So that's a fancy way of saying it sends a report upstairs. At which point, the intellect, the CEO, can grasp whatever's going on and make a fully reasoned judgment, ideally fully reasoned, and then move the will to act. In this case, perfect banana, offered by a coworker who we want to connect to, we want them to like us, and we're starving. So the cogitative power does its job, and it sends this concept upstairs saying, got that, higher faculties? Let's do this. And without even thinking about it, your hand starts coming out of your pocket to take the banana. But now here we are in the intellect, which also does three things. It has the power to know and understand truth. Another word for this is to apprehend. It has the power to reason, and it has the power to judge. So it can also compose and divide. It can compare and contrast, just like the cogitative power. But the judgment of the intellect is superior, similar to how a parent's judgment is superior to a child's. And like a young child, the cogitative power can't truly reason. Just like a child, it doesn't know what it doesn't know. So it's dangerous to let this one drive the bus. So in this case, Our higher faculties have just finished committing to a low-carb ketogenic diet because recently found out I'm this close to having diabetes and I have family members on dialysis and one of them, had a limb amputated. I don't want to go there. So intellect says, thanks, cogitative power. I know that looks like about the best banana in the world. The timing couldn't be better. We forgot our lunch today. I know you want to be friends with that coworker, but we're going to have to take a pass. So will, put the hand back in the pocket. We're going to say no. That would be rightly ordered faculties. The intellect makes a decision, and the other faculties stay in line. However, it's common for things not to go this way. How many of you have ever committed to a diet that went like this? Breakfast starts out pretty virtuous, little snack, salad. Okay, I'll just let myself have 2 Oreos for lunch, and then it goes downhill from there. So what's going on here is the lower faculties have too much power. If we spend too much time cycling around these lower faculties and don't curtail the activity of the memory and the imagination, it's like throwing gas on the fire of our emotions. Again, if you're on a diet and you allow yourself to pick up cookbooks just for fun and read all the dessert recipes and imagine how good they're going to taste when you finally lose that 20 pounds, how long is that diet going to last? The intellect and will can be overwhelmed by strong emotion, especially if they're not strong themselves. They haven't been strengthened, such that it becomes very hard to do what you intend. And once that's happened, even one time, the higher faculties quickly lose the habit of being in charge. How many of you have committed to an exercise regimen and done great for months, and then you go on vacation, and by the time you get home, it's like you never had that habit at all. All the habits you build up, no matter how well you do it, you think, I know for sure it's going to stick this time. Whether it's making your bed, getting up early so you can spend time praying, any new habit we resolve to build, we might do great for some period of time, but when we fall off the wagon even once, it can quickly become like we never had that habit in the first place. So we're talking about habits. Another name for this, for good habits, is virtue. Remember I said rightly ordered faculties look like virtue, and in terms of keeping the faculties ordered, there is really no neutral act. When you act in a way that preserves that right order with the higher faculties in charge, it will be that much easier to do it the next time. It still may take effort each and every time, but each virtuous act makes the next one easier. There's an initial steep part of that curve, but you quickly make progress over time. The reverse is also true. When you fail to preserve that order, when you give in to temptation, even once, it truly does make it harder the next time to choose the good. I don't think I'm telling anybody anything that you don't know from experience. So at this point, I'd like to hopefully start to give you some insight into how we can all make use of Thomistic psychology to change ourselves for the better. We'll go into it more next hour, but consider again what we know about the cogitative power. Has three functions, does 3 things, grasps things, it associates things, and it makes judgments, but they're not mature judgments. It can't really reason. The cogitative power takes emotions at face value, and it doesn't know what it doesn't know. So here's a property we can exploit, if you want to call it that. When the cogitative power gets a new piece of information, it takes it in and it can cause a shift. Sometimes just one small new piece of information is all it takes to completely change the image that's in the imagination, which then associates with a different set of memories and ends up completely altering the emotional response. So you've got a totally different phantasm. So let's go back to the banana that our coworker is offering us. Same setup, we're hungry, on a keto diet, forgot our lunch. Someone we're hoping to be friends with is offering us this banana, which looks like about the best banana we've ever seen. And in this case, our emotions and our physical hunger from just starting this diet are so strong that our cogitative power sends up an over-the-top persuasive phantasm. And the intellect thinks about it for a minute and says, well, you know, I read it's best to ease into the keto diet, actually. So I'll just eat bacon and eggs the rest of the day. One banana is going to be fine. I mean, it's fruit, right? It has potassium in it. And so that hand that had already come out of your pocket reaches out and it takes the banana. Now, your external sense of touch notices something strange. As you grab this banana, it kind of collapses when you put pressure on it, and you hear something squeak. Memory says, that sounds like a dog toy. So the cogitative power says, okay, that banana looks great, but it's not like other bananas. It appears to be a dog toy, and it would not be good to eat. As far as usefulness goes, it has none, except to play practical jokes on hungry coworkers trying to go keto. So now the cogitative power has a completely different phantasm that it's going to send up to the intellect, which now understands that this is not a real banana and our coworker is messing with us. Although this could be a good sign that they like us enough to tease us, or maybe not, maybe they're just mean, but that's a whole nother issue. So the point here is that a well-formed intellect can actually do this for itself. It can supply or go out and find the new piece of information that will bring the cogitative power to a new conclusion, so that it will prepare a new phantasm, one that makes it easier for the intellect and the will to function as they intend. So I have one additional quick example of this, also food-related, that I will sometimes use clinically. So I've actually used this for a long time before I ever encountered these Thomistic concepts, but now I know why it works. It's exactly this thing we've been talking about, a new piece of information that changes the phantasm. So many times I work with young people. To be honest, usually this is a conversation I'm having with a young woman who are in a bad relationship and don't want to let it go. Oh, he's such a good person. I love him so much. There's just this one thing. Often, and I know he can change, I'll help him, right? Often the just one thing is kind of a big deal. Like, he doesn't drive because he lost his license, because he had a couple too many DUIs. Or he doesn't have a job right now. He can't hold a job, but there's always a good reason. It's always someone else's fault or just bad luck. You know how some people just have bad luck. So when something like this comes up and I start getting the idea that this woman is about to make a terrible, terrible mistake, I might talk to her about a pan of brownies. And I did not come up with this. It appears to be one of those internet lore things at this point, else I would give credit where credit's due. But anyway, imagine I'm offering you a pan of brownies, and they look and smell just like any other brownies. They're warm with the crackly top, and you're definitely going to take me up on that. But then I tell you that when I made these brownies, I added a tablespoon of dog poop to the batter. You never would know it. You're not going to taste it. But now that you do know, are you going to try a brownie? This ends up being a very powerful argument because it makes the point that if there's something very, very bad mixed in with a lot of other things that are good, that bad thing doesn't cease being bad. Maybe there isn't much of it, but it's still there, and it needs to be considered along with everything else. So what we're going for here is, like with the fake banana, a shift in the phantasm at the level of the cogitative power. The minute I say dog poop, something fires off in the memory because we all know what it smells like. And this instantly alters the image of those brownies that was in the imagination. When someone is young, and maybe not so young, but gets wrapped up in a relationship where the emotions are very strong, stronger than the intellect and the will, the weight given to that data point about the DUIs or the job issues or whatever is very low. In fact, it's like the emotions are putting up an arm, like nothing to see here. And so what I'm trying to do is to equip a young lady in this kind of a situation to recognize with her intellect, that these are serious red flags, and to send this information down loud and clear to the cogitative power to equip that project managers to shut up the emotions for a minute and look behind that arm, take a really good look at what's there. The emotions will then shift in response to new information, and then and only then put the phantasm together for the intellect to accept and act on. I want to give you an additional clinical vignette that actually happened in my practice not that long ago, as an illustration of another way, another way I might use these principles in practice, because I do like to explain these things to my patients when I can. They find them very useful, when it fits, when they're receptive. Okay, normal disclaimers apply here. Any personal details have been changed to disguise the person that I'm talking about. So in this case, I was seeing a young man who I've seen for a number of years, who is prone to very strong emotional reactions at times. There's a lot of insecurity, a lot of woundedness, a lot of self-medication with food and cigarettes and staying up all hours, doing not good things on the internet. A lot of difficulty trusting other people, but at the same time, a deep desire for community and for God. This young man is not Catholic, but he has a sincere faith in God as he understands him. Let's call him Paul. So Paul came for his appointment one day, explaining he felt confused because he had had an inordinate emotional reaction to a commercial that he saw on television. It was advertising some service like gutter cleaning or yard care or something like this, some home improvement thing. So he had pretty much been up all night. He was so upset. And he explained it like this: whatever the service was, and let's call it landscaping, was something that he had done, paid good money to have done the previous year, and he felt taken advantage of by the guy he had hired. And he was extremely angry about it, but he never said anything. He paid the full amount, and he didn't ask them to come back and fix anything they'd left undone or had done poorly. The reason for this was that the landscaper he hired was the friend of a friend. And Paul was worried about getting good value for his money. So he had asked someone he admired, someone whose judgment he trusted, for their recommendation. And now the person that they hired turned out to be a flake. And for some reason, Paul was just immobilized by this. He was upset with the landscaper, but most of all, he was angry with himself. And interestingly, instead of being angry with the friend who gave the recommendation, he felt this deep sense of shame and insecurity. And he believed his friend had been avoiding him ever since. Although it was probably hard to know because Paul himself had been avoiding his friend ever since this had happened. So as we talk further, he lets slip that the thing he's most upset by is the idea, which he acknowledges sounds kind of nuts, that flaky landscaper did it on purpose. Paul seemed to have this idea that he had been judged and found wanting. The logic here was the landscaper took a look at his house and determined Paul was not worthy of his full effort. He actually used the word cool. he had this idea that the landscaper guy had seen Paul's older car and the dirty, mismatched patio furniture on his deck and put him in the category of uncool and not worthy. And so he did a shoddy job. The idea in the phantasm here is that the friend who referred him was in on it. So you see, Paul considered his friend to be cool. And so clearly, according to this narrative, the friend recommended a fellow cool landscaper who now saw right through Paul and surely reported this back to the friend. So now Paul thought his friend thought less of him. Now, it's pretty clear from an objective standpoint that this is not likely to be what was going on. And even Paul knew this on some level, but his emotions were so strong. So throughout his life, especially in childhood, he'd had all these experiences of not being cool, being on the receiving end of teasing and bullying, harassment. So this is the perspective. These are the memories and associated very strong emotions that his cogitative power was just stuck in and operating under. And God bless Paul, he was trying really hard to get his intellect to settle things down and talk some sense into the cogitative power. Like, that's insane. People don't act that way once they get out of middle school. I wish that were 100% true, but unfortunately his higher faculties were no match for these very vivid memories, very strong emotions. So this was the conversation I was able to have with Paul, because I've previously showed him this faculties diagram, and I told him a little bit about the cogitative power, so he knows more or less what that is. So I told him, okay, Paul, one night I'm alone in my house, and it's late and my husband's out of town. I'm sitting in bed and I'm reading a book, and all of a sudden I hear the front door open, which I thought I had locked. So instantly what pops into everybody's head, like intruder, right? We instantly think of scary movies, the one with the phone call and the operator says it's coming from inside your house. And, we're all scared under these circumstances because the association that our cogitative power is making is with these fearful images in our memory bank, whether it's a movie we've seen or a past experience we've had ourselves. And that phantasm is going to be a scary one. So our intellect is not likely to question it. Our will is going to reach for the phone to call 911, right? So that's what I'm doing. But before I can dial the phone, I hear another noise. It's the toaster. And this changes everything because burglars don't make toast. And suddenly when I hear that noise, I remember my college-age son is home on break, and he's staying out in the ADU on our property, and he was probably hungry and didn't have any food in the apartment, so he's come over and he's making himself a bagel. The sound of the toaster is a new piece of information that pulls entirely different things out of the memory bank, completely changes the associations that the cogitative power makes. The emotions are completely different. The phantasm is completely different. False alarm. I put the phone down and I go back to sleep, or try to go back to sleep. So Paul and I talked about this, and he really got it. And this became his phrase, which has become a thing when I've seen him subsequently for therapy sessions. You got to find the toaster. You have to consider the situation thoroughly with your intellect and try to find or go get a new piece of information that allows you to see the situation and the people in it from a completely different angle. In this case, he was able to question the notion that his cool friend and the cool landscaper were in cahoots. What if his friend had driven by his house and noticed that it didn't look so great and felt terrible that he had recommended someone who turned out to be a flake? Maybe, or maybe the friend had recommended someone that he knew but hadn't actually used yet, And then he had his own bad experience with him. And again, he felt badly that he had given a bad recommendation to Paul. So maybe he really was avoiding Paul, but it was because he felt embarrassed and ashamed.